This is for victims of narcissistic abuse. On your healing and recovery, there's a rest stop. And the rest stop would be articulating the universal nature of your victimization. Now, I call it a rest stop because in your growth, there's going to have to be a point where you recover from victim identity, where you start to really uncover our own causality, not from an invalidation standpoint, not from a right or wrong or morality, but just to start to understand the patterns, the vicious circles, our own past, and its influence on the way that we interpreted reality that could better explain how we would find ourselves in these relationships and maintaining these relationships. Now, the problem is that when you start to, understand that you were a victim, there's going to be a lot of terminology. There's going to be trauma bonds. There's going to be cognitive dissonance. There's going to be all of the different attributes and realities assigned to people with narcissistic personality disorder. And you may find yourself, finding additional vitriolic sentiments directed to these people. The more you learn about them, the more corrupt you recognize them to be. And as you learn more terminology and more psychological understanding, what you want to avoid is merely using that to explain your situation. There's a lot of people that are going around knowing they have a trauma bond, knowing that they have cognitive dissonance, and the knowing of which absolutely simply becomes an additional layer of the reinforcement of victim identity. Before you knew trauma bond, you just had a narcissist, and you had something that you could deal with and recover from. But for many people, the additional information and knowledge simply reinforces a sense of victimhood. And there are a lot of people that represent, our community as survivors that speak from a place of ongoing victimhood. People that are extremely sensitive at the perception of victim blaming, where conversations around someone's own responsibility in their life outcomes becomes a very sensitive topic. And the reason it's sensitive is because many victims harbor guilt and shame that they often are not willing to face. And in avoidance of guilt and shame that they already feel, often the very foundation of what would enable them to be victimized in the first place, they elect to maintain a vitriolic position directed towards a villain. And in that sense, surrender the power of their own being to the maintenance of a positionality about the evil and vile nature of the other person being at the cause of our own suffering. And so this has nothing to do with avoiding the accountability for the betrayal at the hands of other people or their abuse at all. That living in a mindset of fault, blame, shame, and guilt is often going to lead to an arrested development of your own self-awareness. That if you cannot look at your life and your past free of invalidation, in discernment and understanding and empathy for yourself, if you still harbor hidden shame and guilt, if you still want to maintain hatred and resentment directed towards your abusers, if you're unwilling to forgive others and forgive yourself, then that would indicate strongly that you have stopped your growth and development at the rest stop of victim identity. And a lot of people are there with you. If you talk to people that are years out of these relationships, they're still struggling with trust issues, they're still suffering with cognitive dissonance, they're still susceptible to hoovering, They still feel a measure of concern about entering new relationships because they have a lack of self-trust when it comes to the discernment of these other types of people that exist. It suggests to me that there has not yet been a breakthrough in self-awareness that would enable people to uncover the patterns of their own behavior, thought, and emotion that would help better explain how these types of people slip through the cracks and go undetected in our lives, when there are obvious red flag and key indicators in their behavior that surface most immediately in these relationships, that these people are detectable in ordinary conversation and observation. But how do you get there? The problem is that we do a lot to protect the emotions of victims without recognizing that often they have to be able to go through whatever pain is remnant of these relationships, that whatever guilt, shame, and self-blame, whatever self-doubt, whatever is at the source of their reluctance to let go, to move on, to find their freedom, to find peace of mind, to find joy, to find power, to find their self-expression and their voice again. That this discovery has yet to happen. And it has yet to happen in many people that are powerfully advocating for our healing and recovery. And that's not a moral conversation. It's not right or wrong conversation. It's just the reality that there are depths to the game of self-awareness. There are depths to the recovery. And if you're not yet fully free, alive, and empowered, then you're just not done. And it isn't over for you. It's important to say this because I see too much resignation in the space. I see people that become resigned to this idea that they are too traumatized to restore themselves fully, that they have to acquiesce as some kind of abuse survivor and live hypervigilant in avoidance of people in order to protect themselves and have to be on the lookout for red flags. When in reality, once you assimilate a certain degree of awareness, the discernment's automatic. It's not a process of anxiety and fear and self-preservation anymore. It just becomes a function of what you see in the world, that once you see it, once you become self-aware at that level, that discernment is very, very powerful and very palpable and very apparent in the moment and free of invalidation or fear. That you don't even have to let these relationships progress to that point anymore. And that you'll have a measure of protection simply by no longer being a victim, no longer being somebody that doesn't trust yourself, no longer being somebody that depends on trusting others in a vulnerable state, or hiding out in life in avoidance of trusting people, thinking that it was the trust that betrayed them. So it's just food for thought.